Lake Charles was a great place to grow up. Maybe it was part of the times. You know, I was born in 1950. The 50s were wonderful. I loved my time in Baton Rouge when Dad was in law school from 56 to 59, but I loved coming back to Lake Charles. I attended parochial schools. I then attended Landry High School, which has since become St. Louis High School after merging with Sacred Heart and St. Charles Academy. But it was a stress-free existence, a town of just the right size. You could get anywhere you wanted to go in 5 minutes, it seemed. My father had his own grocery store at one point and was successful by all accounts, but he always wanted to be a lawyer. So he entered McNeese, back then it was McNeese State College, in 1952 as a freshman, and began to attend night school part-time. And then he went to LSU Law School and graduated there in January of 1959. He practiced law for about 7 or 8 years and ran for an open position on the 14th Judicial District Court in 1967. He made the runoff in a field of 8 candidates and then won the runoff with 58% of the vote and became a state judge. Then 10 years later, without seeking the position, he was nominated by President Carter to the federal bench in Lake Charles. He was obviously a big role model for me. I had said from an early time I wanted to be a lawyer. In fact, it worried him enough that at one point he asked me, he says, "Are you just saying that because I'm a lawyer?" And I told him, "No, that's what I want to do." My mother was an influence. She was the master of the house. She was a wonderful lady. She was devoted to our education, my late brother and myself. I went to Tulane undergraduate. I had originally intended to go to LSU Law School just like my father, but after being at Tulane, I loved it there. It was a great experience. I loved everything about it, and so I decided I wanted to stay there for law school. In law school, I was lucky enough to clerk during both summers for Max Nathan, who was in every way a lawyer's lawyer. You know, we recently lost Max, but he was an icon in the legal profession, and he was, to this day, he's everything I would want to be. I went to clerk on the state Supreme Court upon graduation for Justice Walter Marcus. He allowed me to participate in drafting opinions early on when he liked my writing, but this is how thorough he was. In the day and age before Westlaw and computers and LexisNexis, he would have me go into the library and pull every book that had a case or an authority I cited and put it on a book cart and roll it into his office. So as he read whatever I drafted, he would pull the book to make sure that it supported the proposition for which I had cited it. That taught me to be thorough and to be careful. I loved the academic aspect. I loved the writing, I loved the research. I know that sounds odd because many lawyers hate those parts. But I loved it so much so that I thought I might want to teach law. I talked to one of my professors at Tulane about it, Bob Force, who's still around to this day and still a dear friend. And he encouraged me to pursue that. So I applied to Harvard Law School to get into their LLM program, which is directed towards developing law professors. That's their focus. And I was fortunate enough to be admitted. I still have the letter giving me admission to this day. And so I went there the next year and got my LLM. Joe Tridico, who was the lion of lawyers in this area, recruited me to come back and practice with him. And growing up, he was probably or easily the most recognized lawyer in the area. And there was a big case coming down. I didn't know it at the time, but 6 months after I was back in Lake Charles, I was sharing closing arguments with him in the first trial of Sheriff Ham Reed, who had been charged by the district attorney in a political war with certain crimes. And that was before a packed courtroom of national news media and spectators. And we got a not guilty verdict. 6 months later, we got another not guilty verdict, and then all charges were dismissed. But the voters didn't like either one of them for that war, and they both lost their next elections. The Schofield firm, Spike Schofield and Tom Bergstead, were extraordinarily talented and respected lawyers, and I approached them and they welcomed me to the firm, and that's where I spent the next 26 years, being a defense lawyer mainly, getting a ton of trial experience. I must have tried 20 to 30 jury trials during my time at Schofield. I started out like most young lawyers, family law, criminal law, get every court appointment, do everything, because I was kind of on my own. I was loosely affiliated with Joe and his bunch of lawyers. But then, when I went to Schofield, I became a defense lawyer and did product liability defense, did all kinds of things. You know, the old jack of all trades, master of none. But I was litigation. And ever since then, I've really just been litigation. I do some contract negotiation, mineral lease negotiation, things of that nature, but it really came out of my experiences. And I became mostly a commercial litigator over the years. After defending toxic torts, I defended a series of phosgene leaks from one of our clients' plants. I defended asbestos for many years. I probably tried 5 asbestos cases to verdict. There was a problem on my great-grandfather's farm that had been operated on by Shell Oil Company for decades, and it was polluted. And when things came to a head and Shell wouldn't clean it up, I decided to sue them at the urging of my cousin Billy Corbello for contamination and for other breaches of both a surface lease and a mineral lease. That led to a very prominently featured case, a multi-million dollar verdict that went all the way through the Supreme Court and became known as the Corbello case, and now those kind of cases are called legacy cases. Well, once that became notorious, I had been representing Big Oil for many years, and I could no longer do that because you're taking positions contrary to their interest. I loved my experiences with them. But depending on who you talk to, at that point I either came over from the dark side or to the dark side. And I began to represent landowners against oil companies. And lawyers around the state became very aware of Corbello. It's complicated litigation. It requires a certain amount of experience and expertise. And so most lawyers did not want to take that on, but wanted to send it to me and have me partner with them in those cases. So we've been around the state. And of course, in this day and age of electronics, your physical location is not nearly as important as it used to be. So you don't have to walk the pleading into the courthouse. You can electronically file things. So that became easier and easier to do, to take on cases in other parts of the state. After the Corbello case produced such massive returns, it was clear that I was a square peg in a round hole at the Schofield firm. It's difficult to represent both plaintiffs and defendants, particularly when you're in the same industry. And so it became clear I needed to move if I was going to continue to handle these kinds of cases. And I joined with Jay Bice and Rock Palermo in January of 2005. And we put together our firm, which is now called Veron, Bice, Palermo, and Wilson. Our firm was one of 3 firms that handled the biggest one, the one that the New York Times called the most ambitious environmental lawsuit ever. Unfortunately, we lost that on some technical grounds. It got removed to federal court. We didn't think there was federal jurisdiction, but the federal court disagreed and then ruled against us, and the Fifth Circuit later said, in a very complicated opinion, yes, there is federal jurisdiction. We tried to get the U.S. Supreme Court to hear it, but as you know, 1 in 1,000 cases gets accepted. Ours didn't. So I'm more famous for a case I lost than probably for the ones I've been fortunate enough to succeed in. I met my wife Melinda through my then legal secretary and still dear friend Pam Oakley. Pam and Philip are good friends of ours. She was Pam's best friend, and Pam introduced me to her. We became friends. I was married to someone else. She was married to someone else. Independently, we went through divorces, and sometime thereafter, our friendship turned into something else. And she was living out of town. She was living in Arlington, and I was, of course, in Lake Charles, but I happened to be in that area on probably a deposition and just called her up, and from there, we began dating, and that's how. She had 2 children, I had 3, and we blended them. I got pulled into doing CLE, continuing legal education presentations, and someone decided they liked the way I did it. They then put me on the CLE program committee of the State Bar Association, and then you miss a meeting and you become the chairman. And I've been chairman or co-chairman now probably 25 years. Winston Day became the chancellor of the LSU Law Center after Dean Hebert retired. And he called me and said, I still think we can get you. He says, will you come? And I said, I'm really not ready to stop practicing law. He said, well, okay, come teach as an adjunct. And I think once you experience it, you're going to want to do it. So I began teaching as an adjunct there for about 9 years. Loved it. My son John then entered Tulane as an undergraduate, and the Tulane law dean, who I'd gotten to know pretty well, said, why don't you come teach that course here and you can see your son? Well, I was much more interested in visiting John once a week than he was in having a parent visit him in his freshman year of college. But I did that, but that became a little more burdensome because you had to stay overnight. I didn't want to spend 7 hours in a car just in one day. I did that for about 3 years. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed my time at LSU as well. I've been active in golf all my life. I've been a USGA committee member for 35 years. Played a lot of golf, done a lot of speaking on golf for the USGA. And one night I was in a hotel room in Baton Rouge, rambling around, and a thought about a book came to me. And I called Bo and I ran the story to him. He says, you got to write it, you got to write it. Well, I wrote it. It literally poured out of me. I dictated the chapters one at a time. And my secretary would type them out, and then I'd play with them a little bit. And it got published by the first publisher I submitted it to. It got written up in the New York Times in a Sunday column as Golf's Literary Rookie of the Year. I got featured in Travel and Leisure Golf Magazine, in USA Today a couple of times. My cousin who lived in Seattle sent me a paper where the Seattle golf column listed it as one of 5 most wonderful golf books ever written. A friend of mine in Birmingham, they wrote a column on it in the Birmingham paper. He called me, a law school classmate sent it to me. And so that led to several more books. And it was so much fun. That first book was The Greatest Player Who Never Lived. The second one was The Greatest Course That Never Was. The third book was The Caddy. The fourth book was The Connecting Game. The fifth book, my agent, who was starving to death on the meager royalties from golf novels, asked me to write a book about the Corbello case. And that became my first non-golf book. That's called Shell Game. And then my last one was No Cure for the Dumbass, which I want to point out is a fictitious novel. It is not an autobiography. My favorite law review article is called In Search of Bigfoot, Confronting Oil and Gas Mythology in Louisiana. It is, anybody who wants to read it, it's a little different. It exposes what I think are the common myths that Louisiana swallows about the oil and gas industry. And you can Google Veron Bigfoot and it'll come up. And to this day, I've reread it. It's packed with tons of footnotes documenting every statement. In fact, some of the pages have 3 lines of text and 45 lines of footnotes. But I wanted it to be not so much an op-ed piece as a legitimate academic exercise exposing certain myths and erroneous beliefs that have dominated the legislature and the court system because of the wealthiest industry in the world having the resources to lobby incessantly. Among my other community activities is I got involved a few years ago in organizing a community bank. At the time, we were the only community bank, the only new bank chartered in the United States over a period of 3.5 years. One of the community activities that gave me great satisfaction was to make sure that our most famous native son, or certainly one of them, Dr. Michael DeBakey, the world famous heart surgeon, was suitably recognized here in town. And that project started when our oldest, Shane, who is the head of dermatology at Dartmouth, became furious. He went to medical school in Houston, and he became furious that they would tell him, well, Michael DeBakey's from Houston, and Shane would say, no, he's from my hometown, Lake Charles. So when they tore down the DeBakey building on Ryan Street, which had his name, the family name on it, Shane called me, he said, they're just destroying every vestige of Dr. DeBakey. You got to do something, you got to do something. So I got fired up. And we launched a campaign to achieve recognition for him. And that led to, among other things, renaming South Ryan Street, where the Heart Center of St. Patrick Hospital is located, Dr. Michael DeBakey Drive. We renamed the airport the Dr. Michael E. DeBakey Aviation Complex. We then got the parish and the city to jointly commission a life-size sculpture statue of Dr. DeBakey that sits outside the front door of the airport. We got a bas-relief put up at the library with a quote that Dr. DeBakey gave us. I would like to be remembered as a good lawyer who took care of his clients and who, at least in my better moments, made our profession look as good as it deserved to be.